The break room fell silent. Every eye fixed on Derek Callahan, the single dad who never stayed past 5, never joined their drinking nights, never dared to dream beyond his paycheck. Ross Whitmore slid a $100 bill across the table, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Ask her out," he said. "Ask the Ice Queen. I dare you." Laughter erupted. Vivian Pierce, the CEO who had rejected executives, dismissed millionaires, frozen out every man who tried. And they wanted him, a site supervisor with calloused hands and a daughter waiting at home, to walk into her office and ask for a date. What they didn't know was that Vivian had been watching him for months. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes lingered on his back every time he left the building at exactly 5:15. And when Derek finally stood before her, voice steady despite his pounding heart, she looked up from her desk and said the words that would shatter everything they believed. "I'm tired of waiting. What took you so long?" Derek Callahan lived his life by a simple code. Show up early. Work hard. Tell the truth. Go home to his daughter. He had learned these rules the hard way in the years after his wife walked out and left him with a 3-year-old girl and a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every month. 5 years had passed since that morning when he found the note on the kitchen counter. 5 years of rebuilding himself into something steady and reliable, something that would never crumble no matter how hard the world pushed. He arrived at Pierce Construction every day at 6:45, reviewed the safety reports before anyone else touched them, and left at exactly 5 o'clock to pick up Penny from the after-school program. His co-workers called him boring. His supervisor called him a problem. Derek called himself a father, and that title meant more to him than any other. The construction trailer smelled like cold coffee and old blueprints, familiar scents that had become the backdrop of Derek's working life. He stood at the planning table, studying the structural drawings for the Riverside Tower project, a 20-story mixed-use development that had consumed the past 10 months of his professional attention. Something was wrong with this project. Derek had known it for weeks, had documented his concerns in detailed reports that outlined material substitutions, skipped inspections, and cost-cutting measures that compromised the building's structural integrity. Those reports sat in Ross Whitmore's desk drawer, buried and ignored, while the project manager collected bonuses for staying under budget. Derek had learned not to push too hard. He had a daughter who needed him employed, a mortgage that demanded monthly payments, and a reputation as a troublemaker that he couldn't afford to strengthen. The trailer door swung open with a bang that made Derek's shoulders tense. Glenn Hartley swaggered in first, followed by 2 junior supervisors who laughed at everything Glenn said, whether it was funny or not. Glenn was the kind of man who measured his worth by how small he could make others feel. A bully who had traded schoolyard tactics for corporate politics without ever growing up. He dropped into a chair and propped his muddy boots on the table, deliberately close to Derek's carefully organized documents. "Callahan," Glenn called out, his voice carrying the lazy contempt he reserved for people he considered beneath him. "Still pushing papers? Don't you have a kid to pick up or something? Must be nice, having an excuse to leave early every day while the rest of us actually work." The junior supervisors laughed on cue, and Derek felt the familiar tightness in his jaw that meant he was grinding his teeth again. Ross Whitmore arrived 15 minutes later, his designer shoes clicking against the trailer's metal steps like a warning. He was a man who dressed for the boardroom, not the construction site, with pressed slacks and a silk tie that cost more than Derek's weekly grocery budget. Ross had never operated a piece of heavy equipment in his life, had never felt the satisfaction of watching a building rise from foundation to finish, but he had family connections and an MBA from a school whose name opened doors. He glanced at Derek with the dismissive expression he wore like a permanent accessory, then addressed the room with the theatrical gravity he brought to every announcement. "Gentlemen, we have a situation. The CEO herself is conducting a site inspection tomorrow. Vivian Pierce wants to see our progress firsthand." He pronounced her name like it tasted sour, his resentment barely concealed beneath professional courtesy. Derek had encountered Vivian Pierce exactly 4 times in his 3 years with the company. She attended the quarterly all-hands meetings, standing at the front of the auditorium in suits that spoke of power and precision, delivering speeches about excellence and integrity that felt painfully ironic given the corruption Derek witnessed daily. But something about her had always captured his attention. Something beyond the obvious beauty and the intimidating reputation. She had a way of looking at people that suggested she saw more than they intended to show, a penetrating gaze that seemed to cut through pretense and politics to find the truth underneath. During the last quarterly meeting, her eyes had swept across the crowd and paused on Derek for just a moment, and he had felt something shift in his chest, something he had thought was permanently frozen. Glenn's voice cut through Derek's thoughts. "The Ice Queen herself, gracing us with her presence. You know she hasn't dated anyone in 5 years? Some lawyer dumped her, or she dumped him. Something about her loving the company more than him." He laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Ross leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Speaking of which, I think we need some entertainment for tomorrow's inspection. A little wager to make things interesting." He pulled out his wallet and extracted a crisp $100 bill, laying it flat on the table where the fluorescent light made it glow. $100 to anyone brave enough to ask Vivian Pierce on a date, face to face, in front of witnesses. "Winner takes all." The room erupted in laughter, and Derek felt the weight of attention shifting toward him like a physical force. Glenn's grin stretched wide enough to show his back teeth. "What about Callahan? He's single, right? Divorced or whatever?" The word landed like a slap, and Derek's hands tightened on the blueprints he was holding. "Come on, Derek," Ross pressed, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "When was the last time you talked to a woman who wasn't ringing up your groceries? This could be good for you. Build some confidence. We all know you won't win, but at least you'll have a story to tell your kids someday." The other men were watching now, hungry for entertainment, eager to witness the humiliation of a man who had always refused to play their games. Derek understood exactly what this was. Not an opportunity, but a trap, a way to destroy him professionally, to give Ross the excuse he needed to finally terminate the troublesome supervisor who kept filing inconvenient safety reports. He should have refused. He should have gathered his documents and walked out of that trailer without acknowledging their cruel game, driven to the school to pick up Penny, and pretended this conversation never happened. But something stopped him, something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the memory of Vivian's eyes finding his across that crowded auditorium. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years spent making himself invisible, acceptable, safe. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of being treated like nothing by men who were worth less than the dirt on his work boots. Derek looked at the $100 bill on the table, then at Ross's smirking face, then at Glenn's eager anticipation of his refusal. "Fine," he heard himself say, the word escaping before his better judgment could stop it. "I'll do it." The silence that followed was almost worth the cold dread settling in his stomach. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and Derek's fraying nerves. He had barely slept, lying awake in his small bedroom, while Penny dreamed peacefully down the hall, turning the situation over in his mind, until it lost all meaning. What had he been thinking? Vivian Pierce was a CEO, a woman who commanded respect from boardrooms to construction sites, who had built her father's small contracting business into a development empire worth hundreds of millions. And he was a site supervisor with calloused hands and a second-hand truck, a man whose greatest recent accomplishment was teaching Penny to ride a bicycle without training wheels. But Derek Callahan did not break his word. He had given it, foolishly and impulsively. But he had given it nonetheless. He would ask, she would refuse, and he would spend the remainder of his career as the punchline to a joke that never got old. Vivian Pierce arrived at the Riverside Tower site in a black sedan that looked surgically clean compared to the mud-splattered trucks surrounding it. Derek watched from the trailer window as she stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a professional twist, her charcoal suit somehow immaculate, despite the dust swirling in the morning breeze. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and expected the world to clear a path, but her eyes told a different story. They swept across the construction site with an intensity that made several workers suddenly find urgent tasks elsewhere, cataloging details that the official reports had carefully omitted. Ross hurried to greet her, his obsequious smile visible even from this distance, but Vivian barely acknowledged him. She was looking at the foundation, at the exposed structural elements, at the evidence of exactly the kind of corners Derek had been documenting for months. The inspection lasted 4 grueling hours. Vivian asked questions that made Ross stammer and deflect, pointed questions about material specifications and inspection schedules, and load-bearing calculations that suggested she had done her homework before arriving. She requested documentation that Ross claimed was being updated. She examined sections of the foundation that were supposed to be off-limits due to ongoing work. And 3 times during those 4 hours, her eyes found Derek across the crowded site, holding his gaze for moments that felt significant in ways he couldn't articulate. After the 3rd time, he could have sworn he saw recognition in her expression, as though she knew something about him that he hadn't told her. It was probably wishful thinking. It was almost certainly wishful thinking. But his heart beat faster anyway. The moment arrived late in the afternoon, when Vivian stood near the project trailer, reviewing documents with Ross and a cluster of nervous executives. Derek's co-workers had gathered at a careful distance, pretending to work, while obviously watching for the show they had been promised. Glenn caught Derek's eye and made an exaggerated gesture toward Vivian, his smirk daring Derek to back down. Ross glanced over and mouthed something that looked like encouragement, but felt like a shove toward a cliff's edge. Derek took a breath that didn't quite fill his lungs, thought of Penny's face, thought of all the reasons this was professional suicide, and walked forward anyway. Each step felt like it covered miles instead of feet. Vivian looked up as he approached, and the rest of the world fell away. Her eyes were the color of aged whiskey, warm amber with depths that suggested hidden complexities. Up close, she was even more striking than the distance had allowed him to appreciate, but it wasn't her beauty that caught him off guard. It was her expression. She didn't look surprised to see him approaching. She didn't look annoyed, or amused, or dismissive. She looked like she had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Ms. Pierce," Derek said, his voice emerging steadier than he had any right to expect. "I'm Derek Callahan, site supervisor for the Eastern Section. I was hoping I might speak with you privately for a moment." Around them, the whispers had already begun, and he could feel Ross and Glenn watching with barely contained glee, already composing the story they would tell about his humiliation. Vivian studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, crisp and decisive. "Walk with me, Mr. Callahan." She turned and moved toward a quieter section of the site, away from the cluster of executives and the watching workers, and Derek followed, intensely aware of every eye tracking their progress. When they were finally alone, standing in the shadow of a half-constructed parking structure, she turned to face him with a directness that made his prepared speech evaporate. "I know who you are," she said before he could speak. "I've read your reports, every single one of them." Derek blinked, thrown completely off balance. "My reports?" She nodded, her gaze never wavering. "The ones about the structural concerns, the material substitutions, the falsified inspection records. Very thorough documentation. Very honest assessments." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like respect. It's remarkably rare to find someone in this company willing to tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Ross Whitmore has been burying your reports for months, but he made the mistake of copying them to a server I can access. Derek's mind raced to process this information. She had read his reports. She knew about the problems he had documented. She knew that Ross had been suppressing his concerns. "Ms. Pierce," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I didn't come here today for a routine inspection, Mr. Callahan. I came because your reports described serious structural deficiencies that could compromise the entire Riverside Tower project. I came to see for myself whether the problems were as bad as you documented." Her jaw tightened. "They're worse. Ross Whitmore has been cutting corners that could cost lives, and he's been covering his tracks with falsified paperwork and intimidated employees." She looked at Derek with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and valued. "You're the only person in this entire project who had the integrity to document the truth, even knowing it could cost you your job. That makes you either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Derek admitted, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile crossing her face. "Ms. Pierce, I appreciate you telling me this, but I should be honest with you about why I approached you today." He took a breath, feeling the absurdity of the situation pressing down on him. "My coworkers made a bet. They dared me to ask you out on a date, expecting you to reject me and humiliate me in front of everyone. It was meant to be a joke at my expense, a way to put me in my place." He met her eyes squarely, refusing to look away despite the embarrassment burning in his chest. "But I want you to know that my asking has nothing to do with their bet. I'm asking because I wanted to ask you from the moment I first saw you, and I've been too much of a coward to act on it until they forced my hand. If you say no, I understand completely. It won't affect my work, it won't change my reports, and I won't bother you again." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of construction equipment and the muffled voices of workers going about their tasks. Vivian studied him with an expression he couldn't decode, her amber eyes searching his face for something he hoped she would find. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her features, warm and genuine, and nothing like the cold mask she wore in boardrooms. "I'm tired of waiting," she said, and her voice held a softness that transformed her entirely. "What took you so long?" Derek's heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. "I'm sorry." Vivian stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and sophisticated that didn't match her Ice Queen reputation at all. "I've been watching you for months, Mr. Callahan. Every time you left the building at exactly 5:15, I watched. Every time you stood up in meetings to raise concerns that everyone else was too afraid to mention, I noticed. Every time you treated the workers on your site with respect instead of contempt, I saw." Her smile widened. "I was beginning to think I would have to ask you myself, and that would have been terribly forward of me." Derek stood frozen, unable to process the words coming from the mouth of a woman he had convinced himself was utterly unattainable. "Friday night," Vivian continued, pulling a business card from her jacket pocket and pressing it into his palm. Her fingers were warm against his work-roughened skin. 7 o'clock. I'll text you the address. Don't be late." She started to turn away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "And Mr. Callahan? I don't accept half measures or men who run from responsibility. If you're not serious about this, tell me now, and we'll forget this conversation ever happened." Derek found his voice at last. "I have an 8-year-old daughter. Her name is Penny. She's the center of my entire world, and anyone who wants to be part of my life needs to understand that she comes first. Always." Vivian's smile softened into something that looked almost like tenderness. I wouldn't expect anything less from a man of integrity. Friday night, Mr. Callahan. Don't be late. The walk back to the project trailer felt like floating through a dream. Derek was dimly aware of the shocked faces watching his return, of Glenn's jaw hanging open, and Ross's expression cycling through disbelief and fury and calculation. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't gloat or celebrate or acknowledge their stares. He simply gathered his documents, checked his watch, and headed to his truck to pick up Penny from school. Behind him, he could hear the explosion of whispered conversations, the frantic speculation about what had just happened, the sound of a $100 bet becoming worthless. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Derek Callahan had a date with the CEO, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt like something more than just a survivor. The weeks that followed were a careful dance between professional obligation and personal discovery. Derek and Vivian met for dinner that first Friday at a quiet restaurant where the lighting was soft and the tables were spaced far enough apart for private conversation. She told him about building the company after her father's unexpected death, about the loneliness of command, about an engagement that ended when her fiancé demanded she choose between him and her father's legacy. He told her about the morning his wife left, about the years of rebuilding, about the fierce, protective love he felt for the daughter who had become his reason for everything. They talked until the restaurant staff began pointedly clearing nearby tables, and when they finally said goodnight in the parking lot, Vivian kissed his cheek with a tenderness that made his chest ache. They continued to work closely on the Riverside Tower project, their professional relationship strengthening alongside the personal one. Vivian trusted Derek's assessments, valued his honesty, and began implementing changes based on his recommendations. Together, they documented the full extent of Ross Whitmore's corruption, building a case that grew more damning with each passing week. But they maintained clear boundaries between work and romance, careful not to give anyone ammunition to use against them. When they were on site, they were colleagues. When they were off the clock, they were something else entirely, something that grew deeper and more essential with every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet moment stolen from busy lives. Penny met Vivian on their fourth date, a Sunday afternoon at the park, where Vivian arrived in jeans and sneakers, looking nothing like a CEO. Derek had been nervous about the introduction, worried that his daughter might feel threatened by another woman entering their carefully constructed world. But Penny had taken one look at Vivian, asked if she liked dinosaurs, and declared her acceptable when Vivian admitted a particular fondness for velociraptors. By the end of the afternoon, Penny was teaching Vivian how to build a proper sandcastle, while Derek watched with a heart so full it ached. Something was growing between the three of them, something that felt like family, and Derek found himself hoping it would last, even as he waited for something to go wrong. The following weeks brought small moments that accumulated into something profound. Vivian learned that Penny liked her pancakes with chocolate chips arranged in smiley faces. Derek discovered that Vivian sang off-key in the car and wasn't embarrassed about it. They developed routines, Sunday brunches and Wednesday movie nights, building the architecture of a shared life one brick at a time. Vivian helped Penny with her science project about volcanoes, getting baking soda and vinegar all over her designer kitchen and laughing harder than Derek had ever heard her laugh. Penny started drawing pictures of 3 people holding hands instead of 2, labeling them Daddy, me, and Miss Vivian with careful crayon letters. Derek framed every single one, but the storm clouds were gathering. Ross Whitmore had not forgotten the humiliation of watching Derek succeed where he was supposed to fail, and he had begun building a case for destruction with the methodical patience of a predator. He documented every interaction between Derek and Vivian, recorded conversations without consent, and began editing the recordings to create a narrative of impropriety. The other workers noticed his surveillance but said nothing, afraid of retaliation. Only old Pete Dawson, A grizzled veteran who had worked for Vivian's father 30 years ago warned Derek about what was coming. "That snake's been making phone calls," Pete told him one morning, his weathered face creased with concern. "Talking to board members, planting seeds. He's going to try to take you both down." The attack came 3 weeks later, delivered with surgical precision at a quarterly board meeting Derek wasn't invited to attend. Ross presented his edited recordings, his manufactured timeline, his carefully constructed narrative of a CEO compromising company, integrity for a workplace romance. The board members listened with grave expressions, already calculating the liability exposure, the shareholder reactions, the media implications. Vivian defended herself with the cold fury of a woman who had spent her career fighting for respect, in rooms full of men who doubted her. But the damage was done. The investigation would proceed. Her judgment was questioned, and Derek's job hung by a thread that Ross was eager to cut. Derek learned about the meeting from Vivian that evening, her voice tight with controlled anger as she explained what had happened. His first instinct was to fight, to storm into Ross's office and force a confrontation, to expose the lies and manipulations that had poisoned the board against them. But Penny's face flashed through his mind, her trusting eyes and innocent smile, and he forced himself to think like a father instead of a fighter. A single dad couldn't afford rash decisions. A single dad had to protect his child's stability, even when his own reputation was being destroyed. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, and the relief in Vivian's voice was audible. "Stay calm. Stay professional. Don't give them any more ammunition." She paused, and he heard her take a breath. "And maybe stay away from the company gala next week. Ross is planning something, and I don't want you caught in the crossfire." The company gala was the biggest event of Pierce Construction's year, a black tie celebration where deals were made and alliances were forged. Derek had been planning to attend with Vivian, their first public appearance as a couple, a statement to the board and the industry that their relationship was legitimate. But he understood the wisdom of her request, even as it burned. He would step back. He would protect her reputation by sacrificing his own presence. He would give Ross nothing to use against them while Vivian fought the battle from inside. That week, Derek worked quietly with old Pete to gather additional evidence. Pete had been documenting Ross's misconduct for months, collecting receipts for material purchases that didn't match what was actually delivered, photographing substitutions that violated building codes, recording conversations where Ross threatened workers who asked too many questions. Together, they assembled a file that grew thicker every day, insurance against whatever Ross was planning. Derek stored copies in 3 different locations, including one with his lawyer. A single father had to be prepared for every contingency. A single father couldn't afford to lose. On the night of the gala, Derek stayed home with Penny, making popcorn and watching movies, pretending his heart wasn't breaking with every hour that passed without news. Old Pete called him at 11:30, his voice urgent. "You need to get to the Riverside site, now. There's been some kind of structural failure in the eastern section. Vivian's already on her way." Derek's blood ran cold. The eastern section, the foundation he had been warning about for months, the corners Ross had cut to boost his bonus. He arranged emergency childcare with Mrs. Patterson next door, promising Penny he would be back soon, and drove through the night with his heart pounding against his ribs. When he arrived at the construction site, the scene was chaos illuminated by emergency floodlights. Fire trucks lined the perimeter, workers milled in confusion, and in the center of it, all stood Vivian Pierce, still wearing her gala gown, her heels sinking into mud, as she demanded answers from engineers who had none to give. The foundation was failing. Not catastrophically, not yet, but the warning signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Cracks in the support columns, shifting in the load-bearing walls, stress fractures that would spread like infection if not addressed immediately. Derek assessed the situation with the cold clarity of experience, his mind cataloging problems and solutions faster than he could speak them. "We need to redistribute the load," he told Vivian, already moving toward the danger zone. "There are emergency shoring materials in the equipment shed. If we reinforce the compromised columns before the stress propagates, we can prevent total collapse." Vivian grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear she was trying to hide. "Derek, it's too dangerous. The engineers say no one should enter until they've completed their assessment." He covered her hand with his own, squeezed once. "The engineers don't know this foundation like I do. I wrote every report on its weaknesses. I know exactly where the problems are and how to fix them. If we wait for official protocols, we might lose the whole building." Old Pete appeared beside them, a hard hat in each hand. "I'm going with him. 2 sets of hands are better than 1, and I know where all the emergency equipment is stored." Vivian looked between them, her CEO mask cracking to reveal the woman underneath, who was terrified of losing someone she loved. "What do you need from me?" Derek took the hard hat Pete offered, settled it on his head. "Keep everyone else back, coordinate with the emergency crews, and if something goes wrong—" He stopped, unable to say the words. Vivian finished them for him. "Penny, I know." She kissed him, hard and fast, and full of everything they hadn't had time to say. "Don't you dare make me explain to that little girl why her father isn't coming home." The next 3 hours were a blur of concrete dust and desperate effort. Derek and Pete worked their way through the compromised section, assessing damage, improvising solutions, reinforcing failing columns with emergency bracing. The work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring every ounce of engineering knowledge Derek possessed and every year of practical experience Pete had accumulated. They communicated in shorthand, anticipating each other's needs, moving through the darkness with flashlights and determination. Derek identified the critical failure points, exactly where his reports had predicted they would be. The places where Ross had substituted inferior materials to save money. He directed Pete to the emergency shoring equipment, calculated load distributions in his head, made decisions in seconds that would have taken committees hours to debate. By the time the official structural engineers arrived with their equipment and protocols, the immediate crisis was contained. The foundation was stabilized. The building would survive. The structural engineers were incredulous when they reviewed what Derek and Pete had accomplished. The improvised bracing system was textbook perfect, positioned exactly where it needed to be to redistribute the stress loads away from the compromised columns. The load calculations Derek had performed in his head matched their computer simulations within a margin of error. One of them, a senior engineer with 30 years of experience, pulled Derek aside and told him it was the finest piece of crisis engineering he had ever witnessed. Derek just shrugged and said he knew the building. He had been studying its weaknesses for months. He had simply done what needed to be done, but the night wasn't over. While Derek and Pete had been fighting to save the structure, Vivian had been fighting a different battle. She had made phone calls to board members, explaining the situation, documenting Ross's responsibility for the substandard materials that had caused the failure. She had summoned IT specialists who traced the edited recordings back to their original files, proving the manipulation. And she had gathered witnesses, workers who had been afraid to speak against Ross, but were willing to testify when the alternative was watching a building collapse and kill people. By dawn, when Derek finally emerged from the construction site, covered in dust and exhaustion, Vivian had assembled everything needed to end Ross Whitmore's career. The board meeting 2 days later was a reckoning. Vivian presented the unedited recordings alongside Ross's manipulated versions. She showed the original reports Derek had filed and the emails proving Ross had buried them. She detailed the material substitutions, the falsified inspections, the systematic corruption that had nearly cost lives and still might cost millions in reconstruction. Old Pete testified about conversations he had witnessed, orders he had received, threats that had been made against workers who questioned the project manager's decisions. And Derek stood before the board and explained, calmly and thoroughly, every warning he had given and every time it had been ignored. By the time the meeting ended, Ross Whitmore was terminated. Criminal charges would follow. His career was over. The aftermath brought chaos of a different kind. Investigations and depositions, and insurance claims that consumed weeks of Derek's time. But it also brought vindication. His reports were entered into official record as evidence of his integrity and foresight. His actions during the crisis were recognized as having prevented a catastrophe that could have cost lives and destroyed the company. The board formally acknowledged that his warnings had been correct all along, that the only failure had been in not listening to him sooner. And Vivian Pierce stood beside him through all of it, not as a CEO protecting an employee, but as a woman defending the man she loved. The board members who had questioned her judgment issued formal apologies. The workers who had distanced themselves during the scandal returned with renewed respect. Glenn Hartley quietly resigned before he could be fired for his role in the harassment. And old Pete, who had risked his job to help expose the truth, was promoted to site manager with Derek as his second-in-command. 6 months later, on a spring afternoon that smelled like new beginnings and fresh-cut grass, Vivian pulled up to a craftsman-style house on a quiet street and handed Derek a silver key. "I bought it," she said, her voice uncertain in a way the Ice Queen never allowed herself to be. "For us. If you want it." The house had a wraparound porch perfect for morning coffee and evening conversations. It had a backyard big enough for a swing set, a garden, and summer barbecues with neighbors who would become friends. It had a kitchen where 3 people could cook together, and a family room perfect for movie nights and homework sessions and lazy Sunday afternoons. It had everything Derek had stopped allowing himself to imagine. Everything he had convinced himself was beyond his reach. Vivian's hand trembled as she held out the key. "I'm tired of waiting, Derek. I'm tired of being careful and appropriate. I want to build a life with you and Penny. A real family. A real home. I know it's fast, and I know we said we'd take things slow, but I don't want slow anymore. I want forever." Derek looked at the key in her hand, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, at the house that could become everything he had stopped believing in. Penny tugged at his sleeve, her 8-year-old face serious with understanding. "Daddy, I think this house has a really good feeling. And Miss Vivian makes the best pancakes." He laughed, the sound breaking through the emotion clogging his throat, and reached out to close his fingers around the key and Vivian's hand. "You know," he said, his voice rough, "when they dared me to ask you out, I thought it was the worst moment of my life. I thought I was walking into a trap that would destroy everything." He pulled her close, felt Penny squeeze between them, felt the 3 of them become something whole. "Turns out it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Vivian laughed against his shoulder, bright and free. "So that's a yes?" Derek kissed her softly, then pulled back to see Penny's delighted face looking up at them both. "That's a yes. 1,000 times yes." Penny threw her arms around both of them, squeezing as tight as her 8-year-old strength allowed. "We're going to be a real family now, aren't we?" she asked, her voice muffled against their embrace. Vivian knelt down to meet her eyes, brushing a strand of hair from the little girl's face, with a tenderness that made Derek's heart crack open. "We already are, sweetheart. We already are." They walked into the empty house together, 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds. The rooms were waiting to be filled with furniture and laughter and the chaos of daily life. The backyard was waiting for the swing set Derek would build. The future was waiting for them to claim it. Some traps were actually doors. Some dares were actually gifts. And some men, the quiet ones who showed up every day and told the truth and loved their daughters more than anything, sometimes got the ending they deserved. Not because they were lucky, but because they were brave enough to walk through the door when it opened. Penny grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the stairs. "I want to see my room. Miss Vivian, will you help me pick the paint color?" Vivian smiled down at the girl who was already becoming her daughter. "I'd love nothing more." And Derek Callahan, the single dad who had never dared to dream beyond his paycheck, watched his family walk into their future and knew he was finally home.